Academic institutions are in the hot seat right now thanks to the wave of pro-Palestinian protests on campuses around the world. Encampments, sit-ins, and walkouts have taken place on nearly 140 U.S. campuses and in more than 25 countries. The protesters' demands include academic and financial divestment from Israel and any companies that are involved in and benefit from Israel's actions. Many also ask for universities to clearly disclose their financial investments, which are often shrouded in mystery. While discussing the protests with family and friends, it became clear that most people have no clue that universities are often linked with and support military contracts, weapons manufacturing, and other shady activities. In fact, most people don't know just how much money is involved with higher education institutions and how that affects each student, faculty, and staff member. So I did some digging, and we're going to do some learning today. If you're wondering why you should care about what I have to say, let me introduce myself. I am a product of American academia. I completed 10 years of school after high school. I earned a bachelor's, master's, and a doctorate in linguistics. I'm a published scholar who has presented my research around the world, and I have been a university professor for the past 6 years. After 16 years, I have a lot of experience and a lot of thoughts about academia. There are parts of it that I love, but the systemic oppression of students, faculty, and the larger world finally won out. I quit. The university, as we know it, didn't show up until the medieval period, but that doesn't mean that higher education didn't exist. The first institutions were all run by courts, religious institutions, or independent scientific entities like a museum or a library. If you ask a typical Western scholar where academia started, you will likely hear about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle having a party in Athens in the 300s BCE. But formal higher education in China and Egypt blows that date out of the water by a good 2,000 years. In fact, by the time the Western-style university was founded, there were already rich educational traditions in Christian Europe, Ethiopia, Greece, India, Japan, Korea, and Persia too. Western imperialism means that we often overlook or simply have no idea of any other ways of thinking or living. While we're going to focus on the modern Western-style university for the bulk of this video, I just wanted to make it clear. This is not and has never been the only philosophy or style of education. It is simply the predominant model we see around the world today. The modern university as a standalone organization of scholars originated in medieval Europe. Founded in 1088, University of Bologna was the first university in the sense of awarding degrees, using the actual word universitas when describing itself, and being independent of church-run schools. The transition from exclusively religious education to a more secular approach was largely driven by the recovery of lost Greek texts. Only 18 years before the University of Bologna was founded, Emperor Justinian's 6th century legal philosophy was rediscovered in Pisa. An Italian dude named Ignarius began teaching those texts, and students started to show up from all over Europe to learn from him. At this time, Europe was increasingly convinced that their future depended on scholarly expertise, and rulers and city governments began establishing universities all over. In the 1200s, this went into hyperdrive after the rediscovery of Aristotle's philosophical work. It had largely been lost in Western Europe over the years, but 3,000 pages were suddenly ready for studying and new analysis. It cannot be overstated how big a deal this was. Historian Richard Dales claimed the rediscovery of Aristotle's work was a turning point in the history of Western thought. These earliest universities all communicated in Latin, and they focused on topics like natural philosophy, metaphysics, and medicine. They focused on Aristotle's work along with the big names in medicine, Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna.
Yes, hello. I'm getting news from later editor me that this name is in fact pronounced Avicenna or Avicenna, which is still a Latinized form of his Arab name, Ibn Sina. He lived from 980 to 1037 CE, and he's the father of early modern medicine. Neat! And back to our regularly scheduled program.
Universities in particular areas had different focuses and conferred different kinds of degrees. For example, the universities in the North in Germany, France, and Great Britain focused on the arts and theology, while those in the South and Italy focused on law and medicine. Scholars would travel around Europe based on their interests and means. In general, this meant that higher education was restricted to the independently wealthy or those with a private benefactor. The universities in different areas were also structured differently. It all boiled down to who controlled the university structure. At University of Bologna, for example, they were student-controlled. They were a self-regulating, independent corporation of scholars. At University of Paris, they adopted a faculty-controlled model where faculty's teaching would address a specific curriculum and train specialists in that curriculum. Other universities were founded by royal and imperial charter to serve the needs of the government. The next 300 years would be characterized by societal upheaval, like European colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, war, famine, and a hearty dose of regicide. This obviously affected universities' growth and financial stability, but academia ultimately thrived. 29 universities across all of Europe would grow to 143, and they would undergo massive changes in both structure and philosophy. I'm not going to bore you with university pseudo-guild structures. It's really weird and convoluted. The important thing to know is that universities started to standardize how they were run. Universities continued to be largely independent, but university leaders were increasingly appointed by the state. Other than that, the curriculum was driven mostly by the faculty, with some other complications thrown in here and there. What is particularly interesting is the shift in that curriculum and how we looked at academia and the pursuit of knowledge. They initially continued the curriculum of the Middle Ages: natural philosophy, logic, medicine, theology, mathematics, astronomy, astrology, law, grammar, and rhetoric. Education was largely about learning to translate and share knowledge by classical philosophers like Aristotle or Hippocrates. And this would change once humanism took hold. Humanist professors set the stage for what we now know as the humanities. They expanded to focus on giving the students the ability to write and speak with distinction, to translate and interpret classical texts, and to live honorable lives. This is when research begins to look like what we consider it today. Instead of just focusing on translations and propagation of ancient texts, scholars were encouraged to adapt and expand on those ideas. For example, Andreas Vesalius advocated the use of Galen's work, but added his own experiments, disagreements, and further research. This coincided with the emergence of the printing press, which allowed for the further spread of these texts and ideas. Humanism in the universities contributed directly to the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment. Scholars were not simply memorizing others' work, but adding their own knowledge and questions. Perhaps unsurprisingly, universities were slow to change. They valued traditionalism and thought the learn everything from Aristotle system was the best. This led a lot of scientists to leave academia itself and instead pursue private benefactors, working for princely courts or forming scientific societies. New scientific constructs during the scientific revolution meant education needed to change. Instead of entering a university to become a general scholar, one would put science first and view it as a vocation in and of itself. A university would thus be created around research, knowledge, and training scholars. Some universities adopted the new approaches, but it would take a while for the universities firmly entrenched in their ways to catch up. The model for a university that we know today, devoted to both research and teaching, didn't emerge fully until the 1800s with the rise of the nation-state. According to Emily Levine, this change can largely be attributed to Wilhelm von Humboldt in Germany. He was tapped to create an institution that would cultivate civil servants and support a more competitive military, while providing scholars the autonomy to pursue their own interests of study. Pause. We need to talk about Wilhelm von Humboldt, an incredibly important but astoundingly racist dude that affected essentially everything in education, anthropology, and linguistics. First, the good. Von Humboldt believed education should be a combination of research and studies, shifting education away from being purely about vocational training to becoming well-rounded and conscientious world citizens. His ideas, emulated when he founded the University of Berlin in 1810, subsequently turned into what we know as the Research University today. We see this in general education curricula, which requires a mix of arts, science, and critical thinking beyond professional skills and study. Now for the bad. In his work in linguistics, he is the epitome of racism and ethnocentrism. In 1820, he proposed that language is the fabric of thought, and a language's structure and grammar reflected a nation's worldview. He argued that languages like English, German, and other Indo-European languages were the most perfect languages, which explained the dominance of their speakers over speakers of less perfect languages. These ideas were later debated and emulated in the beginning of American anthropology by Franz Boas and Edward Sapir. It also directly led to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is worth its own video. Don't worry, it's coming. The takeaway is that von Humboldt had some great progressive ideas for higher education and what it means to be a world citizen. But those ideas were firmly entrenched in a Eurocentric and racist ideology at the height of European colonialism. At no point was von Humboldt's university structure or ideas for world citizenry meant for everyone. It was only meant for those he deemed worthy. And since higher education had, up until rather recently, been only available to those very rich or with very rich patrons, it merely disguised the classist and racist underpinnings already present. Unpause. Von Humboldt's research university quickly became the envy of the world and drew thousands of American students to Germany. Many of those students went on to become university presidents in the US. Dr. Emily Levine, an education professor at Stanford, wrote an entire book called Allies and Rivals about how Germany and the United States essentially competed and learned from one another when pursuing world leadership. New education philosophies and models were proposed, implemented, and improved upon until we arrived to today. By the end of the 1800s, the modern Western-style university had been born. The Robbins Report in 1963 on universities in the UK summarized 4 main objectives essential to any properly balanced system. 1. Instruction in skills. 2. The promotion of the general powers of the mind so as to produce not mere specialists, but cultivated men and women. 3. To maintain research in balance with teaching, since teaching should not be separated from the advancement of learning and the search for truth. And 4. To transmit a common culture and a common standard of citizenship. Universities are thus inherently paradoxical. They are built to encourage academic freedom, but keep the discoveries within our traditional confines, please. They are designed to foster critical thinking and conscientious citizens, but can you fit into our predetermined mold of what that means, please? This paradox means that universities quickly become the epicenter of a lot of civil disobedience and protest. Those conscientious critical thinkers quickly spot the holes in arguments and see the hypocrisy of institutions that market themselves as ivory towers of academic and intellectual freedom while directly contributing to the systemic oppression around the world. And this isn't a new thing. Some of the earliest recorded student protests were organized against church involvement in the 1200s at Oxford and Paris in 1229. Student protests have been behind some of the biggest shifts in global society, and they've also been the site of some of the worst state-sanctioned violence against civilians. In 1968, the largest global protest movement began. In the United States, the protest marked a turning point for the civil rights movement, produced the Black Panther Party, and triggered a broad anti-war movement in opposition to the Vietnam War. France had a strike of up to 10 million workers and seemed viable to overthrow the government. Governments began to crack down on protesters all over, and it became deadly very quickly. There were huge demonstrations in Mexico against the 1968 Summer Olympics and demanding political change. A massacre took place that year when Mexican and U.S. military shot and killed hundreds of Mexican students and civilians. Police opened fire on a crowd of Black students in South Carolina State College, killing 3 and injuring 28. The Troubles kicked off in Northern Ireland, and a civil rights march in Derry was attacked, with marchers surrounded and beaten indiscriminately. More than 100 people were injured, including several nationalist politicians. Columbia students occupied university buildings in 1968, protesting racial segregation in the Vietnam War. 3 university officials were even taken hostage for 24 hours. They wanted Columbia to end the construction of a segregated gymnasium and to cut ties for the Institute of Defense Analyses. The IDA was researching weapons development for the U.S.'s war effort. This was the largest student protest movement in history. It culminated in the Kent State Massacre in 1970 when the Ohio National Guard shot at a crowd of unarmed student protesters and killed 4 and injured 9. In the 1980s, students again organized against apartheid South Africa. Students wanted their universities to divest from firms that supported or profited from the apartheid. 155 universities ultimately divested, and the U.S. government also bowed to the pressure in 1986. Today's pro-Palestinian encampments have made almost identical demands today regarding Israel. But it's the financial investment that most people don't know about or fully understand. So what exactly is an endowment, and what kind of money are we talking about? An endowment fund works similarly to a savings account and can accrue interest over time. Typically, only 4 to 6% of the endowment's assets are spent every year to fund operations or capital spending in addition to tuition. Excess earnings are typically reinvested to grow the endowment and compensate for any inflation or recessions in future years. The investment and spending are typically overseen by a trustee or a team of professional managers. Endowments in some form or another have been used since 176 AD, when Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius created one endowed chair for each of the major schools of philosophy: Platonism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, and Epicureanism. Oftentimes, endowments were made by monarchs or other important people. A similar system was used in Islamic law and madrasas as early as the 800s. Each university has a general endowment fund and may also control several restricted endowments meant for specific areas of the institution. For example, endowed professorships, scholarships, and fellowships. This is very common at US and Canadian institutions, but outside of North America, it's mostly just Cambridge and Oxford. So let's focus on the US situation. US higher education institutions maintain some of the largest endowments in the world. With $839 billion in endowments in 2023, American universities are worth about the same as the annual GDP of Poland. If they were their own country, they'd be ranked like 21st or 22nd globally. That wealth is largely concentrated at the top too. With approximately 4,000 colleges and universities in the US, just 135, or 3.4% of those institutions, hold 84% of endowment funds. Harvard itself holds almost 6%. One of the biggest criticisms of the system is that it's largely up to the university and their financial managers about how much to share about where the money is going. Universities are not required to disclose every detail of their endowment and their investment. The facts change frequently, can be quite complex, and sometimes it's considered proprietary information and is thus subject to NDAs or non-disclosure agreements. Some information is provided to the IRS each year, but it's not very detailed. Activities in foreign countries, for instance, usually only require a general region where the investment can be found. So it largely depends on the university and what they decide to disclose. There is no federal required level of transparency. Current protests have demanded more transparency and financial divestment, but that's complicated in and of itself because at least 38 states discourage or outright ban any kind of divestment from Israel, targeting the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement, or BDS as it's more commonly known. To sum up, there's an obscene amount of money tied up in our universities, and we often don't know how it is invested. We do know, however, that the money is often used to invest in real estate, the stock market, and weapons research and manufacturing. That is not surprising, however, if we remember that universities, at least since von Humboldt became involved, have explicitly been founded as tools of the state with a focus on military readiness. It's also not surprising that the paradox of free thinking and academic freedom almost immediately leads to protest. The fact is, regardless of your own opinions on the matter, these students in encampments or occupying buildings are enacting the very lessons that they've been taught by their professors. They are thinking critically, working towards basic human rights for all people, and they are willing to put their bodies and minds on the line to make it happen. And you know now that this tension between the students and faculty and university administration is nothing new. Universities were slow to change with the scientific revolution, and they will be slow to change now. It should be noted that these are just the broad strokes of a complex history. In fact, we haven't covered many details about American institutions like land-grant colleges, the GI Bill, or McCarthyism in academia. I do think it's important context, however, to the larger conversation right now about universities, their money, and students' rights. The fact that universities are enmeshed in the military-industrial complex, funnel students into elite government positions, and largely finance neo-colonial efforts is not a bug. It's a feature. It was baked into the design the moment European universities came onto the scene, and it is perfectly possible to be firmly entrenched in academia and have no idea about any of this. I am leaving academia for a lot of reasons, but I think the biggest thing I had to learn was that the institution is not only resistant to change, but it is adamantly opposed to it. You are encouraged to become a subject matter expert, to lead global thought within your field, but to submit to administration's choices. The most obvious disconnect for me was watching leading research universities argue against following the science for COVID-19 policies and watching the swift and disproportionate crackdown on student protesters and their right to free speech this spring. And this is all before you get into the toxic view of work-life balance or complete lack of it for academics, building a career based on constant criticism, and trying to navigate a hierarchical system built on exploiting power imbalances instead of merit. So I quit. But I'm not done. I'm sure I'll share more about my own experience in the future, but let me tell you what's in store. The fact is that I love to learn and I love to teach. Add a splash of chaos and you've got the channel. We're not restricted by a syllabus or a standardized curriculum. Here we let curiosity lead and we let chaos reign. Will you join me?